much, Masha. You've said quite a lot of what I was going to say in brief, but I'll be longer about it. I'm not going to talk so much about Russia, where I lived for some years, but about Orwell's view of communism and socialism and Marxism, and what then became his view of what he always called Soviet Russia. He didn't like communism much. None of his writings endorse it. He occasionally, in The Road to Wigan Pier, which I hadn't realised until Masha said, but had been translated as late as the late 30s, he commended a communist speaker the communist speaker was talking about the conditions of the working class, and he said he's quite right. He then went on to say, unfortunately, he's a communist. I'll read some quotations from The Road to Wigan Pier, because Orwell is better than I am on communism. But just to let you see how his mind and his view of socialism and social democracy, his leftism, which I think throughout his life, or much of his life, did vary a bit, was a view of working class decency, fairness, reasonableness, equality, and an equality which in today's circumstances would be seen as extreme, but not actually something which was Marxist, certainly not Marxist, not communist, or even not what you might call strong socialist. He didn't think necessarily that the nationalized industries would work better than capitalist ones. He didn't think necessarily that the proletariat, the working class, was the leading class. It was much more of a kind of William Morris approach, a view which, I forget who it was, maybe Morrison said of the Labour Party, that it was a great social movement in defence of the underdog. He was always for the underdog, and as you know, he lived among the underdog, sometimes because he simply had no money, as often because he wanted to get some material for his writing, including Road to Wigan Pier, Down Out in London and Paris, and so on. Anyway, in the Wigan Pier, he says, "It seems only yesterday that socialists, especially orthodox Marxists, were telling me with superior smiles that socialism is going to arrive of its own accord by some mysterious process called historic necessity. Possibly that belief still lingers, but has been shaken to say the least of it. Hence the sudden attempts of communists in various countries to ally themselves with democratic forces which they have been sabotaging for years past." And then, in showing his contempt for communist theory, he roots that through what ordinary working people, working men as he says, think about it. He says, "It must be remembered that a working man, as long as he remains a genuine working man, is seldom or never a socialist in the complete logically consistent sense. Likely he votes Labour or even Communist if he gets the chance, but his conception of socialism is quite different from that of the book-trained socialist higher up, the intellectual. To the ordinary working man, the sort you would meet in any pub on Saturday night, socialism does not mean much more than better wages and shorter hours and nobody bossing you about. To the more revolutionary type, the type who's a hunger marcher, is blacklisted by employers, the word is a sort of rallying cry against the forces of oppression, a vague threat of future violence. But so far as my experience goes, no genuine working man grasps the deeper implications of socialism. Often, in my opinion, he's a truer socialist than the orthodox Marxist because he remembers what the other so often forgets, that socialism means justice and common decency." That was, I think, Orwell's view of socialism. That's what socialism should be. This section is not about communism per se, but it's relevant to dictatorial communism. And he says, "Sometimes I look at a socialist and wonder what the devil his motive really is. Poverty, and what's more, the habits of mind created by poverty, are something to be abolished in the mind of the socialist from above, by violence if necessary, perhaps even preferably by violence. Hence his worship of great men and appetite for dictatorships, fascist or communist." Remember, this was being written in the 1930s when fascism and communism were growing in strength, and many thought that democracy was over. Indeed, many thought, including in this country, that democracy should be over. For to him, apparently, vide his remarks apropos of the Italo-Abyssinian War and the Stalin-Wells conversations, H.G. Wells met Stalin several times, and like other Fabians, like Bernard Shaw, thought he was a great man. Stalin and Mussolini are almost equivalent persons. The truth is that to many people calling themselves socialist, revolution does not mean a movement of the masses with which they hope to associate themselves. It means a set of reforms which we, the clever ones, are going to impose upon them, the lower orders. Now, as Masha has said, the real hatred of communism, as against the view that communism was something which left-wing intellectuals dreamed up and wished to impose upon people who didn't really want it. The real hatred came from his time with POUM, fighting with POUM, which was, I think, as much an anarchist as anything else. I mean, the Soviets called it Trotskyist because that's the worst thing you could call anything. But anarchism, I think, was really what this movement, very strong in Spain at the time, really was. And he, Orwell, fought for the POUM divisions against the Francoites in the Civil War. He was wounded, had a bullet through the neck, which luckily he survived without any ill effects in the long run. He was almost killed by the communists, was hunted by the communists as being a Trotskyist, and just about escaped through the French border with his wife. According to Raymond Carr, who wrote a good deal about Orwell and about the Spanish Civil War for that matter, Carr says, the Spanish Civil War produced a spate of bad literature. Homage to Catalonia, the book by Orwell, his memoir of that occasion, is one of the few exceptions, and the reason is simple. Orwell was determined to set down the truth as he saw it. He said, Carr continued, he said, this was something that many of the writers of the left in 1936 to 39, period of the Spanish Civil War, could not bring themselves to do. Orwell comes back time and time again in his writings on Spain to those political conditions in the late 30s which fostered intellectual dishonesty. The subservience of the intellectuals of the European left to the communist line, especially in the case of the Popular Front in Spain. The Popular Front was a front for the communists, where in his view the party line could not conceivably be supported by honest men. Only a few strong souls, Victor Serge and Orwell among them, could summon up the courage to fight the whole tone of the literary establishment and the influence of communists within it. Koestler, again Masha mentioned Koestler, with whom he was friendly and who wrote Darkness at Noon. Koestler, unlike Orwell, had been a communist, indeed had been a very active communist. He'd run messages from the banned German Communist Party and been a member of it in the Nazi period in the 30s. Koestler told an audience, quoted to an audience of communist sympathizers, the phrase of Thomas Mann, which was, in the long run, a harmful truth is better than a useful lie, which could be a kind of motto for much of Orwell's writings at this time. And he concluded, Carr concluded in this piece he wrote, the non-communists applauded that sentiment, the communists and their sympathizers remained icily silent. It's precisely the immediacy of Orwell's reaction that gives the early sections of Homage to Catalonia its value for the historian.